Going live. Yes. We are now live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on where we will be today joining Tamar with just a second. There's some technical error. Just hold on a second. There's been some sort of technical difficulty. Just a second. The screen has frozen for me. Okay, sorry. Welcome once again. Today we will be joining Tamar Lawrence-Samuel from Corporate Accountability International for our webinar on conflict of interest in the climate change negotiations. So I'll now hand it over to our partnerships manager, Andreas Sieber, who will introduce us and give a short explanation of the campaign, the speakers, and the climate tracker team.
Sure. Hello, everyone, from wherever you're watching and from whatever time, so it's evening, morning, or whatever time. I'm Andreas. I work with Climate Tracker, and yeah, I'm really excited that we kind of are here together for our COP22 campaign, because most of you are probably watching because you want to go to the COP, and I just kind of quickly remind you what that means. So you know that we're currently in our first publishing window, so you have time till October 7 to publish 3 articles in total, and you probably have already published your first one. And the articles we are currently publishing or concentrating right now are on the fossil fuel industry, and that's also what our webinar is about. So you might know that we have 2 articles on the fossil fuel industry, one on why they shouldn't be in the climate negotiations or have so much influence in that, and we're gonna also, I guess, talk about that in this call. And secondly, also why or how the fossil fuel industry should or could be held accountable for the damage they have done. And if you write these articles and submit them until October 7, you're in the run for, in total, 6 fellowships to go to COP22 fully funded. Also, online writer scholarships. Yeah, and also, and this is for the second publishing window we will tell you about later, you also have the chance to be part of our online school next year. So there's really a lot to win in there. And I just kind of want you to hand over at this point to Tamar, who does like a really, really awesome work on corporate accountability and on holding the fossil fuel companies accountable, but also not that. And there's also a lot of stuff she's done with the tobacco industry. And why don't you just tell us a bit on what you do? How can I imagine what you do in your job?
Well, hello, everyone. So nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am, as my colleagues just said, I'm Tamar Lawrence-Samuel with Corporate Accountability International. So Corporate Accountability International is a 40-year grassroots campaign, corporate campaign organization. So as an organization, what we do is we mobilize millions of people around the world to withhold their support from specific corporations and industries. And then we work to lock in those changes at the international policy level. So taking those really grassroots campaigning victories and major shifts in the world and in the way that things work, and locking in those changes at the policy level. And my role within that is that as Associate Research Director, I take the lead on the campaign development, doing the research to inform our campaigns and how we create our campaigns for the long term. And then I support our campaigners in the day-to-day with urgent or immediate research needs to then implement the tactics and the strategies that we've planned for in our campaigns. And my role specifically on our climate campaign, which is called Kick Big Polluters Out, has been much more of a campaigning role. So I've sort of functioned as our interim campaign director and have been the primary spokesperson and campaigner on this campaign. So that's a little bit about me and the organization.
Thanks so much, Tamar. It's great to have you with us today. And Climate Tracker is really proud of partnering with Corporate Accountability International for this project. So if anyone has questions regarding the webinar that we're going to start now, if you have any comments, please leave them over Twitter directed at Climate Tracking or using the hashtag Climate Tracker. or you can leave your comments on the YouTube stream. So from now on, I'll hand over to Andreas for questions for Tamar.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's kind of start with a bit of the broader picture. So could you just, for the beginning, tell us a bit on like what kind of influence does the fossil fuel industry have on climate policy in general, on the national and also on the international level when we talk about UNFCCC?
Sure, absolutely. There are quite a few avenues for influence that the industry uses to influence climate policy, whether at the international or at the national level. For example, at the international level, we see the industry, whether it's sending representatives to the COPs on government delegations, or participating in negotiations through front groups and trade associations that get official accreditation as business interest NGOs, or directly influencing the government positions at the national level, and then constraining what the governments are able to do at the international level. At the national level, we've seen so many different routes of influence as well, whether it's political spending. In the US in particular, we have almost unlimited political spending, so giving money to candidates to influence how they vote and what their policy positions are, or direct lobbying. So for example, if you all are following some of the US politics that affect and influence the US's role in international negotiations, for example, you're aware that the US has what's called the Clean Power Plan, and more than 20 states, along with corporations like Murray Energy and groups like the US Chamber of Commerce and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, for example, are now suing the federal government to stop the Clean Power Plan, which aims to have states create plans to reduce their individual electricity generation emissions. And over the last 2 cycles, the attorneys general, so the highest level prosecutors in the states who have publicly opposed the Clean Power Plan, have received over $2.4 million, for example, from dirty energy interests. So, that's one concrete example of, in the US, how the industry is influencing policy outcomes. And then if you think about the international level as well, the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol in 1998 is a good example of how the US government, heavily influenced by the industry, really put a stick in the wheels of the Kyoto Protocol and did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, for example. So as we know, in 1998, Exxon helped to create the Global Climate Science Team, which was an effort involving a company top lobbyist and a public representative, and a memo from this public representative to the Global Climate Science Team from 1998 said that victory would be achieved when the average citizens understand, in quotes, or recognize uncertainties in climate science, and that the recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. And you might be following also the Exxon revelations that have been going on for the better part of a year now, where we have found all of this internal evidence, documentation that Exxon has known about the risks of climate change, the effects of climate change, and the role that the industry is playing in causing climate change. So all of this is no surprise to you, I'm sure, but very, very clear and compelling evidence. Another one of the quotes from this memo was that the victory would be achieved when media understands the uncertainties in climate science, and when media coverage reflects balance on climate science and recognition of the validity of viewpoints that challenge the current conventional wisdom. So I think as journalists and as people who are thinking about what role you can play to advance climate policy that actually puts people's lives and the environment before corporate profits, this is something that must strike a chord for you all, because not only are people, the average people, being targeted by these corporations, but the media as well. So those are a couple of examples. And then at the national level or the regional level, for example, we know that Shell lobbied aggressively in 2015 to undermine the EU renewable energy targets, and there was some really good coverage in The Guardian and other places about that. Exxon lobbied against electric cars in the UK. We know that Exxon lobbied against decarbonization and electrification of transport in the EU more broadly. We've seen lots of cases of revolving doors between EDF and Électricité de France and the UK government, for example. And then we've, overall have seen quite a bit of oil and gas industry intensive lobbying in the UK and the EU. So these are all examples of the various avenues that the industry employs to influence policy, to undermine policy, to weaken policy, to block policy even. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that none of these tactics are new, and we've seen them time and again, whether it's with the tobacco industry or other industries taking pages directly from the tobacco industry's playbook in terms of how to confuse people on facts and how to spread disinformation and doubt.
Well, interesting. I mean, like that was like a really like a very, very sophisticated and very, very like loads of examples, really, like how the fossil fuel industry uses their power to influence policy. But I mean, like we're now in the after Paris period, and I think like loads of people kind of celebrated the Paris Agreement as a big step forward. Now, like how agreement actually enable or invite the fossil fuel industry to potentially participate in the policy making process going now forward?
I don't know if you all have had a chance to look at the Paris Agreement itself, or whether that's of much interest. It's pretty dense, and it's quite it covers quite a wide variety of issues. But if you look just at the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement, which is much shorter, the decision 1 CP21 in paragraphs 133 and 134. Sorry for getting technical. I am a lawyer after all. Says two specific things. One is in paragraph 133, it welcomes the efforts of all non-party stakeholders to address and respond to climate change, including those of civil society, the private sector, financial institutions, cities, and other subnational authorities. So what that does is essentially swing the door wide open for the private sector to participate in efforts to address and respond to climate change. And in the next paragraph, it invites non-party stakeholders, referred to in the paragraph above, to scale up their efforts and support actions to reduce emissions and or to build resilience and decrease vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change. And to demonstrate those efforts via the non-state actors zone for climate action platform, the NAZCA platform, and through the LPAA, the Lima Paris Action Agenda. And so not only does the Paris Agreement swing the door wide open to the private sector to participate in essentially providing the solutions to the problem that it has created and is driving, it also then invites the private sector to do CSR, to do corporate social responsibility and PR on those false solutions and non-actions that it's welcoming in the first paragraph. So that is how the Paris Agreement opens up the door for private sector involvement. And so in so doing, it's asking the private sector essentially to increase its involvement. And at the same time, it's failing to put in place the safeguards necessary to protect the process, to protect the outcomes, to protect the parties and their legitimacy and their credibility, and in fact their effectiveness by not providing safeguards to balance and counterbalance this opening of the door. So that's what our campaign to kick big polluters out is really centered on, is this idea that the private sector clearly has a role to play. It has many, many, many changes to make in this process in order for people and the planet to be put ahead of corporate profits, and in order to turn the tide on the imminent crisis that we're in. But what it doesn't have a role in doing is in participating in the process of creating the policies or the regulatory policies that will essentially regulate the industry and its actions and policies and practices.
Wow, right. That was like very concrete, and that probably that's quite new to lots of people, that the Paris Agreement also concretely at the end kind of invites the fossil fuel industry to participate. So, but I kind of wanted to question at this point, maybe first brief question, like obviously the fossil industry is also kind of affected, like as other industries, by these policies. So why shouldn't they have something to say in this process?
The effect on the fossil fuel industry, as on any other industry that will be affected by these policies, is an inevitable effect, right? We're talking about markets, we're talking about economic repercussions, but those are things that should be secondary to people's lives, to people's health, to the health of the planet and the ecosystems, to all of the things that are essentially at the center of these policymaking processes. The fact that the industry will be adversely affected is of much less concern than the fact that the planet is in such a crisis at the moment, and that people are losing not only their homes, but their lives, their livelihoods, their ability to care for their families. And in losing, I don't know if people, you know, how personal this feels to people, especially people like myself sitting, you know, in the United States in a relatively privileged position, where being an activist and an organizer and a human rights advocate, I'm not putting my life on the line in the same way that people in other countries are. But I think that it's very important for us to remember that for some people, losing their home means losing their country, losing their cultural heritage, losing everything that gives them a sense of belonging in the world. And so I think that we should keep our eye on what's really important, which is people and the planet, and think about how we transition to, in a just way, to other economies. And very importantly, I think we need to be thinking about public investment in public services and in infrastructure, and to be thinking about renewables. It's the way of the future. It should be the way of the present, but it's certainly something that that will be an important transition to make very quickly. And if I can give a quick example. In the case of tobacco, for example, that's one of the classic industry arguments, that we're going to lose jobs, people are going to lose their livelihoods if we stop producing tobacco and growing tobacco. What are all the tobacco farmers going to do? And I think it's really important to think about the alternatives, which the tobacco control community has been doing very, very well. And in fact, when we compare the economic costs associated with the harms of tobacco, just like when we compare the costs of the harms associated with climate change, those numbers are in fact much, much higher than the economic costs of transitioning away from harmful industries and harmful products like tobacco or like the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, cool. I mean, like, we now probably are all aware of the problem here, but you mentioned that you want to have some kind of measures in place regarding that. Could you elaborate a bit more? Like obviously we now have like the situation, but what in your opinion should be done about it?
Sorry, I didn't know if you were finished with your question. You froze for a second. So you asked me to talk a little bit about the solutions. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So to be very explicit about the problem before I talk about the solutions, I think the problem that we are talking about here is a problem of conflict of interest in policymaking. So the process we are talking about the context is the process of creating policies to address climate change. And in that public policymaking process, so a process that is an intergovernmental process that should be the prerogative and the responsibility of state governments, the industry has no place, right? And so we talked a little bit about what that means and why, but to be very succinct and very clear about it, there is a conflict of interest between the objectives of the industry, which are profit motives, and the objectives and the outcomes of a process like the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement that are focused on policy solutions to address climate change. And a conflict of interest can actually arise when activities, relationships, or situations place a public institution or an individual that represents that institution in a real, a potential, or perceived conflict between its duties and its responsibilities to the public and personal, institutional, and or other interests, right? So what can be done very specifically in this context is, and in very plain terms, right, a conflict of interest is essentially the fox guarding the hen house. And I know we've used this analogy before, but it's quite, you know, it's an easy visual to conjure in your mind when you're thinking about, okay, but what is this really, you know, how does this look? Well, it looks like the fox holding the door to the hen house shut and fending off others, right? We know that's not what's going to happen. And as our ally and 350.org co-founder Bill McKibben has said, it's essentially letting the professional arsonist join the volunteer fire department, you know, just another visual for you. So what can be done to address conflicts of interest? Well, the first thing that must be done is to acknowledge the possibility of conflicts of interest and to take steps to address that reality. In the context of tobacco, which is where our experience in this realm comes from, in the early 2000s, the World Health Organization was in the process of negotiating a treaty on tobacco control called the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And that convention now, as a result of incredible work by a coalition of groups from the Global South and governments, contains a provision called Article 5.3. The WHO FCTC Article 5.3 essentially says that in setting and implementing their public health policies with respect to tobacco control, parties to the treaty shall act to protect these policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. And what that means is that parties to this treaty, in ratifying this treaty, are taking on the responsibility to protect, to insulate their public policy making process from the interests of the industry. So essentially to exclude the industry from creating the rules that will be used to regulate it. So essentially, again, keeping the fox away from the hen house, out of the hen house. So our campaign to keep big polluters out is focused on replicating this very important, majorly precedent-setting piece of international law in the context of the UNFCCC. So that's the first solution, is a comprehensive Article 5.3 policy within the UNFCCC that will exclude the industry and any entity representing the interests of the industry from any aspect of policy making that would regulate this industry or would affect this industry's practices and policies. So that's part one, is Article 5.3 for climate. And then in a much more narrow sense, one of the principles that was created around this Article 5.3 for tobacco, so the 5.3 was adopted with the convention and ratified in 2003. And then in 2008, 5 years later, the parties unanimously adopted a set of guidelines for implementation, which are essentially a set of principles and recommendations that give color and shape what this one sentence in the treaty says. So there are several principles in there, including there's an affirmation that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the tobacco industry's interests and public health policy interests. That's very, very important, right? Critically important to affirm that, to state that. And that becomes the stepping stone to create policy to ensure that that reality is addressed and taken into account. Another of the principles, for example, is that parties, when dealing with the tobacco industry or those working to further its interests, should be accountable and transparent. So essentially, when parties are dealing with the industry for the purposes of regulation, when they're asking the industry to provide information about their practices and their policies so that they can regulate them properly, they must be accountable and transparent in doing so. And it goes on and on for a couple more principles. But within those are a set of specific recommendations of actions that parties or that governments at the national level should take to implement Article 5.3. And I'll pull out just one of the, I think, 11 or so recommendations. And it's the one on avoiding conflicts of interests for government officials and employees. For those of you who participated in the climate negotiation session, the intersessional in Germany, in Bonn, in May, was it May of 2016? It might have been May or June. During that session, parties, nearly 70% so parties representing nearly 70% of the world's population stood up in a closing plenary for one of the bodies of the UNFCCC and insisted that a policy on conflicts of interest needs to be established at the UNFCCC, and that in doing so, this body that has been operating in a specific way for 20 years must make a significant change and address something that should have been addressed a long time ago. But what the FCTC, the Tobacco Convention, says about avoiding conflicts of interest for government officials and employees is essentially a higher level of detail of what this looks like. What it would look like, for example, is that the involvement of organizations or individuals with commercial or vested interests in the industry in public policy making is most likely to have a very negative effect. And so clear rules regarding conflicts of interest in policy making for government officials and employees working with in that policy making space are really important, and a very important means for protecting these policies from interference by the tobacco industry. It also says things like payments and gifts and services, or monetary or in-kind and research funding offered by the industry to government institutions creates a conflict of interest, and so on and so forth. But essentially it mandates that a policy on the disclosure and management of conflicts of interest be created and implemented. So that's what that's the second piece, the sort of narrower portion of what 5.3 for climate actually means, is to start with a conflict of interest policy, a policy that would acknowledge conflicts of interests are possible when the door is swung wide open to the private sector, and that would lay out a process for identifying those conflicts of interest, for mitigating or addressing those conflicts of interest, and then the broader 5.3 policy would state things like the industry can't be involved in the process, delegations can't have industry members on their government delegations, right? Things like that.
Thanks so much, Tamar. That was a really nice insight into the history of how Article 5.3 came about for the WHO and the kinds of conflicts of interest that the UNFCCC currently has to deal with. But when you were discussing the guidelines, we didn't actually discuss the incentivization and preferential treatment clause in those guidelines. So we were looking through the guidelines, and the preferential treatment guidelines for the tobacco industry was very clear in Article 5.3, where you're not supposed to give subsidies or financial incentives to the tobacco industry. But
right.
When we're talking about ensuring that the private sector does not have a conflict of interest in the UNFCCC negotiations, at a time when all of us are pushing really hard to have renewable energy as the most viable option, and most governments across the world are offering financial incentives and subsidies for the renewable energy sector. Do you think the possible debate between the fossil fuel industry and the renewable energy sector with respect to conflict of interest even from the renewable energy sector, because they are definitely benefiting from preferential treatment? Now, all of us at Climate Tracker and elsewhere, we are for this sort of incentive, but how do we equalize this stance with our insistence on Article 5.3 like regulations for the UNFCCC?
That's a really very good question. I think the way to think about Article 5.3 is as an equalizing measure, like you said, something that that creates the political space for governments to do what they need to do to address climate change, unencumbered, unhindered by the influence of an industry that is whose profits are being threatened, essentially, right? So when we talk about the renewable energy industry, we're not talking about when we talk about renewable energy specifically, we're not talking about energy that is going to devastate the planet at the same at the level that dirty energy is, right? So in the context of a 5.3 for climate, I think it's going to be very very important to think in a nuanced way about which of these aspects of the policy actually do help to create the political space and not undermine the political will of governments to do what they need to do. Part of the concern, I think, with this idea, or part of the rationale for the inclusion of this idea of not incentivizing the tobacco industry to continue as business as usual, was the fact that that when the tobacco industry is provided incentives to continue business as usual, or when the tobacco industry is being invited into the policy-making space, it undermines the political will of governments to take action. So when the industry says, "Oh, don't worry, we have this set of voluntary rules that we're going to implement because we recognize the concerns that you're putting forward and why you would want to implement this kind of policy, but don't worry, we'll take care of it with this voluntary set of standards," then there's no enforcement mechanism attached, right? So the idea of not providing incentives for the tobacco industry to continue to operate the way that it is, I think, is really important when we think about dirty energy. And I think in the context of climate, we should think about whether it's an industry that we're targeting in terms of not providing incentives, or whether it's the practices or the products or the specific focus on dirty energy that we're not incentivizing.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, that's exactly the kind of nuanced argument we were hoping our trackers would hear from you, because they have to face this sort of criticism from industry, industry writers, from industry representatives, saying that, it's just preferring one energy over the other. But there has to be a very clear distinction between what energy is being preferred and why. And like you said, in tobacco, the clear conflict of interest not only between the policy and the industry, but also between public health and the industry has to be differentiated. So
exactly.
Thank you so much for that. And
if you think about the role of the UNFCCC as a body creating public policies to resolve climate change, then there's less of a gray area, right? It's very clear that if one industry is proposing solutions versus another continuing business as usual, then it's much easier to think about how to create a policy that addresses that effectively.
Yeah, you're right, because even in the corporate social responsibility part of the of Article 5.3, with respect to CSR, it's very noticeable that many fossil fuel industries are trying to greenwash their efforts using the term energy industry, and the energy industry includes dirty energy, black energy, green energy, all of those. So to use that energy industry as a term itself is very dangerous when we're talking about this. So thank you for making those distinctions. So moving on from the FCTC for a while, could you tell us a bit more about the kind of terminology, or the kind of we've already discussed the solutions before, but the kind of terminology that the UNFCCC should be using to describe this conflict of interest with respect to the fossil fuel industry, more specifically in the upcoming COPs?
So there are several other UN entities and regional entities and national level entities that have very, very strong policies on conflicts of interest already. For example, the OECD has a set of policies on conflicts of interest. Any one of the things that I think was most notable for us at the last bond session was to hear representatives of certain governments who have law degrees talk about not knowing exactly what a conflict of interest is. So I think the terminology that the UNFCCC needs to start using is sort of unabashedly talking about conflicts of interest as a reality. Just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean that it's not a major impediment to progress. So I think talking about these issues in open spaces where and acknowledging their reality, and then as an immediate follow-up step, starting to take action to acknowledge them and to address them. And if I understood correctly, your question is about what parties need to be doing right now and how we should be talking about this in the space. Is that right? So I think it's really important for parties to start acknowledging the reality, to start taking steps to address it, but also for civil society to take an active role in calling out this reality. One of the most surprising things overall is, having been involved in the UNFCCC now for a little while, has been to see the contrast, for example, between the discussions around this issue there versus in places like the tobacco COPs. I don't know if any of the trackers will have a chance ever to go to an FCTC COP, and I don't know if you've ever talked about this with anyone, but it's quite massively different to be in that space than it is to be in the UNFCCC space. Article 5.3 is the term of the decade, right? So everybody's talking about Article 5.3. Government delegates are unabashedly calling out industry for any attempt at interference, and panels are being organized by governments on this issue. They've obviously unanimously voted to adopt the guidelines in 2008 on how to prevent these things. So it's quite a different atmosphere, but it hasn't always been that way, right? It was very much an uphill battle in the early 2000s during the negotiations on the treaty, and even during the negotiations on the guidelines for implementation, where it took a group of determined and courageous global South governments to band together and to stand up to the intimidation and the economic power and might of the tobacco industry, either directly or as represented by certain other global North governments, to be able to advance something like this in that space at a time where the tobacco industry was a very different animal than it is today, at a time where tobacco itself was much less, or the industry itself was much less vilified than it is now. Now, it almost goes without saying that tobacco is harmful and that the tobacco industry has one single purpose, and it's to sell and addict people to a product that kills you, essentially, right? There's no useful or acceptable use of tobacco. In any case, it's harmful. So I think that's where we need to be headed at the UNFCCC. We need governments, whether large or small, whether southern or northern, to start to stand up and call it like it is, speak truth to power, and not allow the industry and the governments representing its interests to intimidate it. And the easiest way to do that is to clear the space and to create that political space to make those decisions that are otherwise much, much more difficult.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, the past decade has also seen a massive drop in tobacco usage and smoking, especially in the United States, from the data that is available. So I think something right is happening, and usually the kind of efforts that we see at the COPs and at various international fora don't usually translate into data till much after. So this example of the tobacco industry is a great way to inspire people that actually this kind of campaigning works. If you just look at the decline in smoking rate and tobacco consumption across the world, especially after this was implemented, So, like you mentioned, there's a lot of money in the tobacco industry, and there's far more money in the fossil fuel industry. It's one of the possibly the biggest, one of the biggest industries in the world. And with the kind of money that they have to lobby with government officials, to acquire other energy companies, and to sort of create a monopoly on the agenda in the energy industry, do you think, what are the steps you think that people should take in order to lobby against this kind of COI at a civil society level? And since Climate Tracker is a network of young journalists from across the world, and it's a mixture of global north, global south, languages including Arabic and you know French, and so many representatives from oil producing countries. So what are the kind of efforts you think that journalists and civil society actors should be taking to avoid this conflict of interest?
Great question. I think I'm going to take the two parts of the question separately. So I'll start with civil society, if that's okay, even though I'm talking to a group of journalists, and then I'll talk about journalists, because I think the role of each segment is a little bit different, right? So in terms of civil society, I think what is absolutely critical is to counter what is one of the most powerful, richest industries in the world. There is no amount of money that we can raise and collect that will even allow us to compete in that sphere. So the power that we have is in our numbers and in making our voices heard. And so one of the things that civil society groups and people and social movements around the world can do is to join the campaign to kick big polluters out, as a way of building this power and as a way of showing our might, faced with the fossil fuel industry. And so far, I think we are at about 570,000 members of this campaign, and over at least 60 organizations that have joined the campaign. So that's the first thing that civil society or people around the world or social movements can do. The other thing is to be having these conversations, whether it's in your own networks or whether it's in the UNFCCC as a space, to start shifting the climate around these issues, no pun intended, right? We need to shift the public climate. We need to start making this subject of discussion not taboo, but instead just matter of fact, and in fact absolutely necessary. It almost goes without saying that where you have these conflicting interests, you have to have a safety net, a mechanism to ensure that they don't get out of hand and have terrible consequences. And then with specific regard to government officials and interacting with government officials, it's really important for people, if they have access and the desire to do so, to be speaking directly to the decision makers in their capitals, in their countries, to make it very, very clear that this is a priority for people, for their constituents, and that is who they are accountable to, not the special interests like the fossil fuel industry that are filling their pockets. And a couple of very practical and upcoming opportunities to do this. The first is October. The full month of October is the month of Reclaim Power. And you may have heard about this already. This is the third year in a row that groups are coming together in October to organize actions all around the world, calling for reclaiming our power, democratically managed energy sources, all of these different demands that are really important to people all around the world and that are unifying for people all around the world and that are applicable in every local context. And in the week of October 17th in particular will be the week where the Reclaim Power actions will be focused on kick big polluters out. So if any civil society groups and organizations are interested in holding events, those can look like protests in the street, journalist trainings, press conferences, delegations to your government delegate's office with a petition delivery or something like that. All of that will be happening the week of October 17th. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to connect people to the right people to do this. We have resources available like organizing guides and action planning guides, as well as template media materials that we're also happy to share. And then the next UNFCCC opportunity coming up is in May 2017, so 6 months after COP. There will be a formal workshop during which this issue of conflict of interest will be addressed by parties. And so that's another thing to look forward to. And there will be an opportunity to make written submissions to UNFCCC for groups to voice their concerns around this issue and to make demands for what parties should be doing to address them. And the deadline for that will be February of next year. And then finally, COP22 obviously is the next opportunity to make noise and be seen and be heard about this, and to put pressure on the governments that are not inclined to take this seriously, to take action on this, and also show our support for the governments that are doing so. And so we'll be in Marrakesh in full force and organizing actions and things like that. So people should look for that to join those. And then to shift to the media and reporters and what journalists can do to advance this issue. For decades, the industry has been shaping the narrative. And as we've seen through the reporting on Exxon, it has spent those decades spewing disinformation and creating confusion and doubt around the reality of climate change, its causes, its effects, and the industry's role and responsibility in driving it. So what's really important now is to be shifting the narrative away from these red herring arguments and to speak truth to power, right? So journalists get training that they're supposed to tell the two sides of the story, but when in fact there is only one factual side of the story and the other one is motivated by profits, it's really important for journalists to be digging deeper, to be questioning the motives of the special interests and their talking points, to be looking one layer underneath, to be looking at where the money is coming from to fund certain efforts, and to really do some good investigative journalism, even if it's not in-depth, long-form articles, but at least to be looking at things with a critical eye. And it's finally our time to be shifting the narrative and to be speaking truth to power. So I think that's something that the trackers have a huge role in shifting and in advancing.
Well, thank you. And I think like there's quite some momentum from what you just told going on. And I think like one of the questions from our audience we have goes in that direction as well. And you also already mentioned the discussions going on in Bonn. So Pahari from India mentioned the big lobbying push by the fossil fuel industry for 2 instead of 1.5 at the COP21. And she just wonders like if there are already any plans or already some kind of more concrete things going on within the UNFCCC process to combat these things or to prevent those lobbying processes. Like is there some kind of momentum not only outside the UNFCCC but also inside for the kind of demands you just made?
That's a really great question, and I think that is precisely another perfect example of the influence of the industry, right? Because as a result of this heavy lobbying, what we ended up with in the Paris Agreement is an aspirational goal of 2 degrees with a, and if possible, if we can get to 1.5, then yeah, why not, kind of thing, right? So, so that lobbying was quite successful, and that's what Article 5.3 and what a conflict of interest policy aims to resolve. Unfortunately, within the UNFCCC, and like in the UN overall, I think the trend has been increasingly toward these public-private partnerships, these major CSR efforts, all of the Paris Agreement swinging the door wide open to the industry is not an isolated incident. It's really a massive international or intergovernmental trend that's happening across the UN system. So unfortunately, no, nothing is happening within the UNFCCC to combat that, except for the momentum and the movement of the governments that stood up in a plenary session for the first time in 20 years and argued with the US and the EU and the chair of the subsidiary body for implementation during the closing plenary in the Bonn session to say, no, our voices need to be heard. We are demanding that action be taken around conflicts of interest, and that's exactly what will help to insulate governments from this heavy lobbying. And the beauty of Article 5.3 is, if you think about the tobacco context, is that it creates a policy at the international level that creates obligations at the national level for governments to implement at the national level, so that when they're creating their national level policies and determining their international negotiating positions, their processes are protected from the industry's influence. So it's not just what can be done at the UNFCCC in a vacuum, right? The strategy is really what can be done at the UNFCCC that will also, and most importantly, have an effect at the national level, because primarily this lobbying that happened around the 2 degrees and all of the other lobbying that happened primarily happens at the national level before governments even get to these international negotiating meetings.
Thank you so much, Tamar, for that inspirational conclusion to that question. And I really liked your phrase, speak truth to power. And I think we're going to definitely be using that in our communications henceforth, especially with respect to the corporate accountability campaign. So, like you said, that the United Nations currently at the UNFCCC level doesn't have these plans to combat that, because most governments are working with the private sector, but through our journalists on the ground pushing for their local representatives, national representatives to take a stand against these kinds of conflicts of interest, we're hoping that this campaign delivers significant results in the coming few weeks and months. So it's been great having you here, and it was an honor to have you share your views, experiences, and insights with our network. And it was definitely a pleasure for me and Andreas to talk to you today. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you both. It was really a pleasure being here and having the opportunity to talk about these issues a little bit more, and also just great to hear the questions that you proposed, or that you posed, and the questions from the audience as well. I think it's really it makes me feel really excited for what's possible in the future, to know that people are having discussions about this and interested, and going to be working on this with us in the future. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. As you know, continue being part of our CAI campaign and keep writing in our several campaigns for the COP. Thanks for joining us today. And this is Andreas and Mrinalini signing out. Thanks, Tamar, again. Bye-bye. Have a good night. Yeah.